The laughter started as a ripple, then grew into a chorus. At the edge of the training field, under the scorching Oklahoma sun, a group of cadets pointed at the helmet in the old man's hands. It was army green, pitted and scarred, its surface streaked with rust like dried blood. The chinstrap was frayed, the paint chipped to bare steel. One cadet snickered loud enough for the others to hear. "Hey! Did you steal that from a museum, Grandpa?" The others joined in, their voices dripping with the invincibility of youth. They wore modern Kevlar helmets, sleek and new, with rails for night vision and mounts for optics. Their uniforms were crisp, their boots unscuffed. In their eyes, the man before them was a relic. His name was Frank Delaney. 71 years old, shoulders still square, though his back had felt every decade. He'd been invited to the academy not as a lecturer, but as a demonstrator, an old soldier showing a new generation the basics of field survival and close-quarters defense. No one had mentioned his service record. No one had told the cadets that the helmet they mocked had once saved an entire squad in a valley half a world away. Frank set the helmet on his head with a calmness that made the laughter falter. The strap clicked under his chin. His eyes, pale blue and unwavering, swept the cadets without a word. The field sergeant barked for silence, and the training resumed. They were about to run a live-fire maneuver, short bursts at pop-up targets, movement under cover, real bullets cracking over the dirt. The cadets moved into formation, their energy reckless. Frank stood off to the side, observing. He didn't flinch at the first shots. He'd heard too many before. He only shook his head when a private tripped in the dust, muzzle swinging dangerously near his teammates. The range officer shouted corrections, but discipline in a young unit is fragile. It happened in an instant. A cadet stumbled on loose gravel, his finger tightening by accident. The rifle bucked, a live round hissed sideways, hot and fast, aimed not at a target but at Frank Delaney. The crack split the air. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Then came the sound, an ugly metallic clang, sharp as a hammer strike. The cadet spun, eyes wide. Frank staggered a half step, then straightened. The bullet had struck the rusted helmet dead on. The steel, outdated and mocked, had held. A white scratch cut across the pitted surface, fresh and glaring under the sun. Gasps rippled through the line. The cadet who had fired the shot dropped his weapon, face drained of blood. "Sir, I didn't mean." Frank raised a hand, silencing him. He unclasped the strap and lifted the helmet slowly, deliberately. He turned it so they could all see the scar gouged into the steel, the place where the round had stopped cold inches from his skull. Then he spoke, his voice low, carrying across the stunned field. "You think this helmet is a joke. You think rust means weakness. Let me tell you something. This steel is older than you, but it's seen more than you'll ever imagine. It's been through fire, mud, and hell itself, and it still does what it was made to do." He paused, letting the silence press on them. "You laughed at history, and history just saved my life." No one laughed now. The cadets stood rigid, shame burning in their young faces. The range officer barked for order, but Frank didn't wait. He set the helmet back on his head and looked at the one who had fired. "Next time you carry a weapon, son, remember it doesn't forgive mistakes. And neither do the men who trust you with their lives." From that day forward, the cadets no longer saw an old man with a relic. They saw a veteran who had worn steel into war and brought it back scarred but unbroken. The rusted helmet was no longer an object of ridicule. It was a reminder that strength doesn't shine. Sometimes it endures, battered and silent, until the moment it's needed most. The laughter came first, quick, sharp, almost nervous. It started at the far end of the firing line where the sun hammered the dirt flat, then spread like brush fire until half the cadet platoon was chuckling. Under that hard Oklahoma sky, where the air shimmered like molten glass and the smell of gun oil hung heavy, a group of 20-year-olds found something they thought hilarious. It wasn't the heat or the drill sergeant barking cadence. It wasn't the pop-up targets waiting to be shredded by live rounds. It was the helmet in the hands of the man standing just off the line. Army green, pitted and scarred, edges chipped to bare steel. Rust clung to its crown like dried blood, its strap frayed and brittle. It looked ancient, wrong, out of place among the sleek Kevlar domes strapped tight on their own heads. "Sir," one cadet said, too loud, his voice cracked with mockery. "You forget to turn that in after World War II?" The line erupted, the sound carrying over the flat range. Another chimed in, "Looks like something from a pawn shop." A third, "Hey, Grandpa, you lose the rest of the museum too?" The man at the center of their jeers did not smile. He did not frown. He did not answer at all. He was tall still, though age had pulled at his joints. His field jacket was bleached almost white at the shoulders by decades of sun. The sleeves were rolled to his forearms, the patches worn, the fabric frayed. A wide-brim hat shadowed eyes pale as frost, eyes that had watched jungles burn, deserts rage, and mountains swallow men whole. His name was Frank Delaney, 71 years old, retired sergeant first class. Brought here not to entertain, not even to teach, at least not officially. The Academy's command had invited him as a guest observer, an old soldier meant to inspire discipline in the new generation. No one had said what he'd done, where he'd served, or why the brass still answered his calls after all these years. To the cadets, he was just an antique, a prop, a relic, and the rusted helmet in his hands was the punchline to their joke. Frank lifted the helmet with slow, deliberate care and set it on his head. The laughter faltered for half a second, then died under the weight of his silence. He tightened the frayed strap beneath his chin, then folded his hands behind his back and stood without a word. The drill sergeant's whistle cut through the air, silencing whatever chuckles remained. "Eyes front!" he barked, voice gravel and thunder. "Formation ready. Today's not playtime, this is your first live-fire exercise. Move like it's combat because accidents kill. Understood?" "Yes, Sergeant," the cadets chorused, too loud, trying to hide the embarrassment still buzzing in their throats. Boots shuffled into position, weapons checked, bolts racked, magazines seated with sharp clicks. The line became a wall of black rifles gleaming in desert sun. Frank didn't move. He stayed just behind them, a shadow in the heat, helmet gleaming faintly where rust caught the light. He wasn't there to shoot. He wasn't there to prove anything. But his presence prickled. A few cadets stole glances back at him, uneasy now, though they couldn't say why. The whistle shrieked again. The drill sergeant's arm slashed down. "Range is hot. Targets up." Metal silhouettes snapped upright 200 yards out, painted green and brown to blend with the scrub. The line came alive. Bursts cracked in rhythm. Dust kicked up. Brass clattered across the dirt. The smell of propellant spread sharp and acrid, the air vibrating with the percussion of rifles. Frank watched, unmoving. His gaze drifted along the line, noting the way cadets leaned too hard on their triggers, how their shoulders jerked, how their eyes darted too fast. He saw the mistakes before they happened. He always had. Behind the laughter earlier there had been arrogance, the kind only youth carried, the kind that confused inexperience for invulnerability. He knew it well. He'd seen it broken out of boys in places far from Oklahoma, places where helmets were not props but lifelines. And as the exercise unfolded, a knot in his chest told him they were about to learn that lesson the hard way. The first burst of fire rolled like thunder over the flat range. Brass clinked and bounced across the concrete pads. Cadets shouted target confirmations, and the drill sergeant's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Short bursts. 3 rounds. Don't cook those barrels, you idiots." Sweat poured from under Kevlar rims, soaking collars, stinging eyes. The Oklahoma sun pressed down mercilessly, baking rifles until they smelled faintly of scorched oil. The cadets huddled behind their firing benches, leaning into the recoil with the awkward rhythm of men too new to trust their weapons. A few hit their marks. Targets flipped back with satisfying clangs. Others peppered the dirt, chewing dust a foot short or a foot wide. Frank Delaney watched from behind them, helmet still strapped under his chin, arms folded. His pale eyes flicked from one cadet to another. He didn't see sharp uniforms or new gear. He saw shaky stances, wandering muzzles, the telltale signs of nerves hidden under bravado. He knew that recipe. He'd smelled it before battles that had turned fields into graveyards. A corporal at the far right. Reynolds, he thought he'd heard the name, jerked his trigger too hard. His muzzle swept left before he corrected, sending a round hissing dangerously wide. Frank's jaw tightened. Another, Martinez, had his cheek too high on the stock, his eye wandering from sight to target, never truly locking in. The line was young, green, and cocky got people killed. The sergeant barked again. Advance. 5 meters. Move and fire. Boots scrambled. Dust plumed. The cadets jogged forward, weapons spitting in ragged rhythm. They were supposed to move as a unit, overlapping fields of fire, covering each other. But adrenaline made them sloppy. One surged ahead, another lagged behind. A formation fractured by ego. Frank stepped forward, closer now. The helmet's rust caught a flash of sunlight. He scanned, measuring every angle, every twitch. His gut told him what was coming even before he heard the sound. Reynolds stumbled. His boot caught on uneven gravel, his body pitched forward. Instinct made his finger clamp down. The rifle barked once, sharp, uncontrolled, sideways. Time fractured. Frank heard the hiss before anyone else realized what had happened. A live round slicing across the line, not toward the painted silhouettes but directly toward him. For a heartbeat, the entire range froze. The sun glare, the dust, the ringing of nearby shots. All of it collapsed into that one streak of lead. Then came the impact. The bullet struck dead center on Frank's helmet with a metallic crack so violent it echoed louder than the rifles. Sparks jumped. The sound wasn't hollow like a ricochet. It was a hammer on steel. His head rocked back, his knees buckled half an inch, but he did not fall. Gasps exploded from the line. Reynolds's weapon clattered from his hands. Martinez swore, face blanching. Even the drill sergeant's voice caught in his throat. Frank straightened. Slowly, deliberately. The helmet bore a fresh scar now. An ugly gouge running across its dome. The steel dented, paint stripped to raw silver. Rust flakes crumbled to the dirt at his boots. The cadets stared, wide-eyed. None of their modern helmets, none of their fancy polymer composites had ever been tested like this before. They didn't know if theirs would have stopped it, but the rusted relic had. Reynolds stumbled forward, horror written across his face. "Sir, I didn't." His voice cracked, breaking into something raw. Frank raised one hand, palm open, halting him without a word. He unclipped the strap and lifted the helmet from his head. His gray hair stuck damp with sweat, but his eyes were steady as ever. He turned the helmet slowly, so every cadet could see the dent, the scar, the place where steel had stood between him and death yet again. Silence swallowed the range. The drill sergeant didn't shout. No one dared. The only sound was the wind rattling through distant grass and the faint ticking of hot barrels cooling. Frank's voice broke the stillness. Low, calm, and heavy. "You think this helmet's a joke?" He turned it in his hands, sunlight glinting off the fresh wound in its crown. "You think rust means weakness? That old means useless." He looked up, pale eyes like frost cutting through each cadet in turn. "This steel is older than you, but it's seen more than you'll ever imagine. It's been through fire, mud, and hell itself. And it still does what it was made to do." No one moved. No one spoke. Reynolds's throat worked, but no words came. Frank slid the helmet back on, tugged the frayed strap tight. He stood taller now, the dent gleaming like proof. "You laughed at history," he said, "and history just saved my life." The cadets who had mocked him shifted uneasily in their boots. The laughter gone from their eyes, replaced by something heavier. Respect. Fear. A dawning humility. The drill sergeant finally found his voice, but it was different now. Quieter, rougher. Range safe. Weapons down. The exercise was over. But the real lesson had only just begun. For a moment no one breathed. The echo of the accidental shot still clung to the air like smoke after a fire. Rifles hung limp in nervous hands, magazines still seated but forgotten. The dented helmet on Frank Delaney's head gleamed under the sun, a brutal reminder of just how close the training exercise had come to ending in blood. The drill sergeant's voice, usually a cannon blast, was now a rasp. "Cease fire," he repeated, though the order had already been obeyed. "Range is cold. Step back. Weapons safe." The cadets obeyed in silence, their boots grinding against gravel. No one dared speak. Their eyes flicked to the veteran, then darted away, as if meeting his gaze too long might expose something in themselves they weren't ready to face. Reynolds, the one who had fired, stood frozen, his hands trembling as though the rifle he dropped still burned him. His lips moved soundlessly, searching for words that would never carry enough weight. Martinez clapped a hand on his shoulder, not to steady him, but to keep him upright. Frank stood calm as stone. He tugged the strap tighter beneath his chin and let his pale eyes travel across the line. Every cadet who had laughed at him felt it like a blade. His stare wasn't cruel, wasn't angry, but it carried a weight more crushing than either. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to punish. His silence did all of that for him. The drill sergeant finally strode toward him, jaw clenched so tight a vein pulsed in his temple. He stopped short of Frank, as though the dented steel crown above those pale eyes made him hesitate. "Sir," he said, his tone uncharacteristically careful. "Are you injured?" Frank shook his head once. Helmet took the round. "I'm fine." His voice was even, calm, with no trace of tremor. It was the steadiness of a man who had been here before, in hotter places with worse odds. The sergeant exhaled through his nose, relief mingled with shame. He turned on his cadets, ready to unleash fire, but Frank's hand rose, halting him. "They don't need your shouting," Frank said. "They need your listening." His words dropped heavy into the air, not loud, but commanding in a way that made the sergeant close his mouth. Frank looked back at the cadets, their crisp uniforms now damp with sweat, their faces pale under the desert sun. "You came out here thinking this was about shooting paper and punching your time card. You thought you were safe because this is training. Let me tell you something, there's no such thing as safe with live rounds. Discipline doesn't come from gadgets on your rifles. It comes from respect. Respect for your weapon, respect for your teammates, and respect for the men and women who carried these lessons before you." His hand rose, fingers brushing the dent in his helmet. "This steel," he said, his tone low but cutting, "saved me today. Not because it's magic, not because it's indestructible, but because it was built for a purpose and used with respect. Some of you laughed at it, laughed at me, but when the bullet came, it didn't ask for your opinion. It just struck. And the only reason I'm standing here is because this piece of history still remembers what it was made for." The cadets shifted uneasily, shame burning behind their silence. The cocky smirks from earlier were gone, replaced by stiff jaws and lowered eyes. Even Reynolds, trembling, forced himself to look at the old man, tears glinting in the corners of his eyes. The drill sergeant cleared his throat, but his voice cracked as he said, "Platoon, stand at attention." Boots slammed into gravel. Spines snapped straight. But this wasn't the crispness of confidence. This was the rigidity of guilt, of men trying to hold themselves together under a weight they hadn't expected. Frank stepped forward, slow, deliberate. He walked the line, helmet dent gleaming, eyes sharp. When he stopped before Reynolds, the cadet braced as though expecting a blow. But Frank only placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "You'll carry this with you," he said, voice softer now. "The sound, the mistake, the scar on this helmet. You'll remember what it felt like to nearly take a life. Don't run from it. Let it teach you, because next time it might not be me standing there. It might be one of your own." Reynolds swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "Yes, sir," he whispered, his voice shaking. Frank let his hand fall, then stepped back to address them all. "You think you're soldiers already because you wear the uniform. But this," he tapped the dent with his knuckle, the sound sharp and metallic, "is what makes a soldier. Not laughter, not arrogance. Responsibility, respect. That's what keeps you and the person next to you alive. No one argued. No one even blinked. The drill sergeant nodded, his face grave. Platoon, salute. 20 hands snapped up in unison, the gesture stiff and sharp. It wasn't just respect, it was apology. Frank didn't return it. He didn't need to. He only nodded once, almost imperceptible, then turned away, his boots crunching in the silence he had carved. Behind him, the cadets held their salutes longer than regulation required, as if afraid to lower them too soon. The dented helmet caught the sun one last time before he stepped off the line, leaving them with a silence that weighed more than any gunfire. And in that silence, they understood. The rusted relic wasn't a joke. It was a shield, a reminder, a lesson etched in steel and nearly in blood. Morning came sharp and bright over Fort Ironside. The Oklahoma sky was a hard blue, the kind that left no room for shadows. Dew clung to the grass at the edge of the range, sparkling like fragments of glass. Cadets filed in, boots thudding, rifles slung. But there was none of yesterday's cocky chatter. No laughter, no jokes, only the quiet shuffle of young men and women who had carried something heavy back from the line. Frank Delaney was already there. He sat on the bench nearest the firing pads, helmet on his lap, as though it had never left. The fresh dent in its crown caught the morning light like a scar stitched into steel. His posture was easy, unhurried, but the weight of his presence pressed down harder than the sun ever could. The drill sergeant blew his whistle, crisp and sharp. Platoon, form up. The cadets scrambled into position, their movements sharper than usual. Their eyes flicked once toward Frank, then snapped front again. The sergeant's gaze swept them, reading the difference instantly. Yesterday had burned something into them. He let the silence stretch, then said, "Before we begin today's drills, you've got something to say." His eyes narrowed. "Do it right." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the youngest of them, Martinez, stepped forward. His rifle clutched tight, his throat working. "Sir," he said, voice steady but low, "we owe you an apology. For yesterday. For mocking what we didn't understand. For disrespecting what we hadn't earned." His chest rose, fell. "We were wrong." The words seemed to crack the ice. One by one, cadets stepped forward. Reynolds, still pale from the memory of his stray shot, was next. His voice broke as he spoke. "Sir, you should have been dead yesterday. Because of me. And you're not. Because of that helmet. Because of you. I'll carry that for the rest of my life." Others followed, adding their voices, not excuses but acknowledgments. Each admission weighed heavy in the air, and with each one Frank felt their arrogance dissolve. They weren't boys playing soldier anymore. They were young soldiers beginning to understand. Frank listened without interrupting. When the last voice faded, he rose. He placed the helmet on his head, tugged the strap tight with the same deliberate calm as always. He looked at them, not with anger, not with pity, but with something deeper. "You've learned the first lesson," he said, voice carrying across the still morning. "That uniform doesn't make you bulletproof. It doesn't make you invincible. It makes you responsible. For yourselves, for each other, and for the history you stand on." He tapped the dent with his knuckle. The metallic ring echoed. "This helmet's not a relic. It's a reminder. Men better than me wore steel just like it and never came home. You'll carry your own reminders someday. Don't laugh at them. Don't forget them. Respect them. That's the only way you earn the right to wear what you're wearing now." The drill sergeant's voice cut in, rough but softer than usual. "Platoon attention." Boots snapped. Spines stiffened. A single command rolled out like thunder. "Salute!" 20 hands rose in unison, palms slicing the air, snapping to brows with precision sharper than anything they'd shown before. It wasn't regulation perfect. It was better. It was sincere. Frank stood still for a long moment, eyes moving across the line. Yesterday, those same faces had been bent in laughter. Today, they were carved in stone, their gaze steady, their salute held until muscles trembled. Slowly, Frank raised his own hand. His salute was not crisp. It was old, heavy, the motion of a man who had raised it too many times over too many caskets. But it was real, and when he held it, the air itself seemed to tighten. The salute broke together, but the silence after carried more weight than any order. For the cadets, it wasn't just respect for a man. It was respect for a history they had dismissed, for a piece of rusted steel that had carried the ghosts of wars they would never fight, for the realization that someday, they too would wear reminders of their own. The sergeant cleared his throat, his eyes glinting. Platoon, dismissed. The cadets turned to leave, but not one passed Frank without a nod, a glance, a silent acknowledgement. Reynolds lingered longest, eyes flicking to the dent once more. Frank caught his gaze, gave him the faintest nod. It was enough. When the field was empty, Frank sat again, removing the helmet and setting it beside him. The sun caught its scars, new and old, until it gleamed like a metal no one could ever pin. He traced the fresh groove with his finger and let the silence wash over him. The laughter of yesterday was gone. In its place was something stronger, something he hoped they'd carry longer than any drill. Respect. Because in the end, that was what kept you alive. Not Kevlar. Not steel. Respect. The cadets came to the range that morning full of laughter. They left with silence heavy in their chests. What they mocked as a relic had proven itself in the harshest way possible, by stopping a bullet meant to kill. That rusted helmet wasn't just steel and straps. It was history, sacrifice, and survival. Frank Delaney didn't wear it to impress anyone. He wore it because it had carried him through jungles, ambushes, and battles no one in that platoon could imagine. Every dent, every scar on its surface was a reminder that strength doesn't shine. It endures. The cadets learned that respect is not optional. It is the line between arrogance and survival. Heroes don't always wear medals on their chest. Sometimes they sit quietly, helmet dented, eyes steady, waiting for the world to remember what true discipline looks like. On that field, under the Oklahoma sun, the cadets finally understood. If the story moved you, honor it. Like this video to show your respect for the veterans who carried steel before Kevlar. Share it with someone who thinks age means weakness. And subscribe to Endless Stories, where legends aren't myths. They're real men who still walk among us. Because sometimes, a single dent in steel carries more truth than 1,000 lectures.